most universal experience ever: death. And in this time when there's so much polarization and it's like everybody has some different take on every single thing and we're just drowning in different takes on everything every day, what if we talked about the thing that is actually the most universal, the thing that everybody has to recognize is real and will happen to you: death. So there's something refreshing to me, actually, dare I say, comforting about the universality of death in a time when we're so polarized and so atomized by social media largely, where it's like everybody just has a different perspective on everything and it feels like nobody can get along, and how are we ever gonna all get along in this like increasingly divided and polarized society where we're all just consuming everybody's opinions all the time. And of course, the answer I come back to, and people have come back to time and time again, is what are the things that are common to the human experience? Where is our shared humanity? And what is more shared than death? So we are going to talk about all things death on the live stream tonight. I want to talk about generally just our approach to death now in modern Western societies. I want to talk about how we view death, the symbol of death, the way it informs our worldview, and how your relationship to death as a concept, as a symbol, can actually clarify the way you view the world and perhaps the problems with how you view the world, and give some clarity in terms of like, what should I be doing? What matters to me most? Where am I getting stuck? Where do I need to grow? And so, of course, we're going to talk about Joseph Campbell's work. We're going to talk about Carl Jung's work, because death factors largely into both of their views. And so we'll talk about that. I also want to discuss just generally the research side of death as something to keep close to you in life, and how we can integrate death more pragmatically as a part of our life. Like, how does our views on death and keeping that kind of like more top of mind, as opposed to just like something we ignore all the time until it's thrust into our face because someone dies or we're going to die, what if we brought it a little more into life instead of just leaving it into those like extreme fringe moments that are rare? Hopefully you don't have a ton of people dying around you. And how does that help us to live better? And this is part of the problem, I think, with modern life in the West and how we relate to death, is that we actually don't have death around us as much as people used to. We don't have as many kids dying in childbirth and in their first few years. We don't have as many people dying of treatable illnesses. We don't have, in the United States, a war on our soil that we know people who are going to die in this, and that like there's this looming threat of destruction and death for our way of life and the people that we know. We have so many different instances where death has been pushed out of everyday life. And while this is good in many ways, there are, of course, ramifications for how progress influences us. And so, just like so many things, as we have the choice to push death further and further from our lives, we then have the responsibility to actively engage with death in a productive way of our own doing. Now we have to be the ones that say, okay, I don't have death around me as often as people used to. So what does that mean? What might I be lacking because of that change? So we're going to try to get some of that back. And I'm kind of excited about it. You know, like I was planning the live stream also, and I was just like, well, everybody seems to just talk about whatever is going on in the news and whatever the daily drama is. And I thought about how I just don't care about that so much. And that it feels to me like this very ephemeral thing. If I'm like, oh, today they released the Epstein files, but they're not actually really released. And like, why are the influencers taking pictures with it? And it's just like, this is going to be irrelevant tomorrow when there's some new development in the story within like literally 24 hours. And then whatever I say about this will be kind of irrelevant forever, like literally forever. No one will care about me being like, can you believe the influencers were taking pictures with the thing instead of telling us about the thing? Like in a year from now, no one's going to give a shit about that commentary. It's going to be gone with the wind. Death, on the other hand, is going to be relevant for a very, very long time, even in the context of eliminating death, right? Because we have this other element in modern life where you have people that are actively trying to increase longevity. And what's that guy, Brian Armstrong? What's his name? The stop dying guy, the never die guy, whatever his name, the one that does like all these weird health protocols in order to not die. So you have this kind of relationship with death in our culture, which is really interesting and different from most of human history, where that was not even remotely a thing you could entertain unless you were one of these people that was like, we're going to find the fountain of youth, like going on an expedition to find some mystical fountain of youth or something. So of course, there's always been desires for immortality, but it hasn't ever really melded with the idea of a secular view of immortality. So we have all these things that are related to death. And I just think that that's so much more interesting, relevant, and informative to us than like whatever the news cycle today for 5 seconds is. Because I mean, it's not that there's not relevant news, but not all of it's relevant. And I don't want to keep up with all of it. So this is what we're going to do here today. We're going to talk about death. And so leave me any comments you have, any thoughts you have about death and its role in society now, in our culture now. Because my conception is that we really do not have as much of a relationship to death in modern culture today as humans used to for most of human history. And there's reasons for that are great, which is like less people are dying, less children die in the few first years of their lives. And so like death is just not around us as much. But that comes with consequences. So let's talk a little bit about incorporating death into your perspective on life. So my thoughts on this is just like the obvious, right? Which is the more you have death in mind as a thing that's going to happen, as a thing that could happen, the more likely you are to be able to be grateful for life. And I think this is one of just like the key things that we tend to just kind of let go, right? Because it's so easy to just get wrapped up in living that we forget that life is not something that you are guaranteed, and that life is something that can end very abruptly. And if you keep that in mind more, as opposed to doing what I think is more easy for us to do than ever, which is just completely ignore the fact that life is very fragile, unpredictable, and the reality is that those news stories you see where someone fell down and hit their head and died, and they were only 40, and they left behind their wife and kids, and it's like, gosh, that's just so terrible. I can't imagine. That could happen to you. That could happen to you. There's no reason why that couldn't happen to you. But we tell ourselves that that couldn't really happen to us. That's something that happens to that poor, unfortunate soul, not to us. And so then we just continue living our lives in this kind of like quasi-immortal energy where we feel like we have so much more time than we have any reason to believe is guaranteed. Because there is no reason to think that you cannot be that person who just has that sad, tragic accident and dies. It happens all the time. And the crazy thing about spending some time thinking about that kind of fragility, that kind of mortality, is there's no way that you can actually disperse with it. I mean, if you think I'm wrong about that, please let me know, because anytime I think about the fact that there is nothing so special about me and my life that I am protected from that kind of random tragic death, it really unnerves me. And it just feels so real. And that's the kind of meditation on death that I think is actually healthy. So it's a little bit that truism that doing hard things is good for you. And one of those hard things actually is these kind of difficult reflections by which we think about our own mortality. It's just that. That's really all this like death practice I'm talking about is. It's like, just truly think about the fact that your life is not something you are guaranteed. And all those tragic stories of people that had an accident and, oh my gosh, I can't believe someone would die like that so suddenly. They thought that it would never happen to them either. And so truly thinking about that, taking some time to actually connect with that feeling. It's the feeling, right? It's not just the intellectual exercise, because that's the trap, is that we'll often tell ourselves, yeah, life is unpredictable. Yes, we are mortal. Yes, I could die at any time. There, for the grace of God, go I. I could be that person. You can say all these things to yourself and be in your head when you say them, and not actually feel what it feels like to truly believe it. And this is something that I've really come to understand more and more as I've had different experiences where I'm like, oh, I get it. Like those kind of things where it's like, I thought I knew this thing, and then something happened and I got it. Like, it's just like that shift within you where now you have this embodied understanding, this like true sense of, oh, I know what it feels like to think you're almost going to die, and to realize truly how fragile life is and how unpredictable life is. Those kind of experiences are the ones that are actually shown in some research to really change people for the better. These kind of like near-death experiences, people that got that second chance where by all intents and purposes, they really should have died and they got very lucky. There are accounts of those kind of situations impacting people so significantly that they have these different experiences like post-traumatic growth, or just a significant increase in their appreciation for life. And so it's that kind of feeling that we actually should be seeking when we meditate on the idea of our mortality. It's not just that intellectual exercise of like, oh, I know I could die at any moment. That's not the thing that moves you to live differently. The thing that will move you to live in alignment with that truth that, yeah, life really is this fragile. I really could be the person that is in that tragic accident where someone else is reading the story and being like, oh, I can't believe that would ever happen to someone. Oh, that's terrible. And then they go on and live their life thinking that would never happen to me. You could be the person that someone else is reading about a tragic accident happening to. Even though we only have the experience of being the person who reads about the tragic accident. And so it's hard for us to really embody that sense of truly, there for the grace of God go I. And so trying to connect to the feeling is really the thing that we're doing. And I think that this is the weird thing about modern life, and maybe I'm a little more unique in this, but I've really been sheltered from death in my life. I only recently went to my first funeral at 33 years old, and it was my grandmother's funeral, who lived to be 94. So all of that is just like incredibly great fortune. The fact that my grandmother lived so long, the fact that I've never been to a funeral before that, the fact that the funeral that I went to was someone who lived a long and fulfilling life. All of these things are like really the best intro to death you could have. And I've had it so late in life. And so I know there's many people that have gone to funerals when they were kids, and, you know, like it's a much more present thing in their life in that way. But most of us don't have the kind of connection to death that people had thousands of years ago, where you could have been taken out by an infection. Okay, that is a lot more death happening in people's lives when a simple infection can take you out. And so you had these instances, right? Like, I mean, I know we went through the pandemic, and that was like one of these things that I think actually thrust death into our face in a way that people in modern Western society aren't really accustomed to having happen. This kind of like collective threat of death, not just someone I know died, someone I know of was killed, those kind of like individual experiences of death, which are of course still meaningful, but death on a collective level, death culturally being experienced on that collective level is like a very significant change for most of us. I think the only thing I could remember potentially being comparable to that kind of thrusting of death into the cultural consciousness in that way would be 9/11. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any good things that come to mind as like, when were we all forced to really reckon with our mortality and the threat of being killed or dying on a collective level? At that level, there's very few times. And so that's great, right? That's very lucky that we don't have these instances of like mass death on such a normal basis, that we're all grappling with death at that level. But on the other hand, that does then allow you to kind of distance yourself from the reality of your mortality. And that's the thing that I think we need to account for. People have made criticisms of Western culture as being very youth-driven, very like youth-centric, right? And in some ways, I think that may relate to the fact that we are very able to push death and mortality out of view because of the benefits of modern medicine and the fact that we don't have like ongoing conflicts on our soil and things like that. And so that kind of like youth-centric culture may be one of the effects of that. And so what does that mean then, right? Because what even is a youth-centric culture? I don't want to get too off in this tangent because usually people are just talking about like the fact that like, oh, all the models are young. And it's like, okay, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I think there's very good reasons for why people want like models that are in the prime of their physical life. But there's other elements to it also, right? Which is, we're not actually often including older generations in our cultural conversations in a way that is very productive. And personally, I see that very much in like the boomer, like, okay, boomer rhetoric, where it's just kind of like this disdain for previous generations. And while there's plenty of reasons to have issues with the things that previous generations did, there seems to be very little accounting of the fact that people who have lived longer than you may know more things than you in some way because they're in a different life stage. And you just don't see a lot of that accounted for in Western culture, the stages of life. And so what's really interesting about thinking about death and how this relates to living is that death is a stage of life, right? It's the end stage. It's the stage at which life ends. But it's also like this symbolic factor, right? And so it's something that Carl Jung has talked about as part of your life story. And Joseph Campbell has also described as like a kind of metaphorical symbol for rebirth, for the kind of like death of your older self so that a newer version of yourself, a more expanded version of yourself can be born. And so in some ways, like our disdain for older generations and this youth-centric culture might kind of parallel the kind of naive look on the world that young people have, right? As if there's nothing for me to learn from the past. I will always be this way. I have all the time in the world. These are the things that young people tend to believe and tend to feel in some ways. And so it's worth considering whether we also have that on a cultural level. Are we a youth-centric culture that also believes that we don't have things to learn from the past, that also believes we have all the time in the world and that nothing will ever really change, so don't worry about things? So these are the things that meditating on death, the finiteness of life, can be clarifying for. Let's say, let me look at some of the notes that I have here, because we got a long show and I want to get through these things. But please leave any comments you have about how you see death as a part of our culture, whether you see the same thing that I do, that we kind of just don't engage with it at all, and what you think the implications of that are. Some leaving art school said, yeah, that's what attracted me to click on your live stream. I wish I knew what that was about, what that was in reference to, because I'm looking at it too late, but I'm glad you clicked. Okay, so let me get to my notes here, because there's a lot of things that I want to cover. So we talked about the idea of death being something that enables us to have a more grateful perspective on life, and to kind of have a little bit more clarity. And so that is one of the things that I think, in not engaging with death very much on a cultural level and also on an individual level, we lose out on the chance to have more clarity about what matters, both societally and individually. What do we care about most? What are we using our limited time for? What really should be our priorities? And it's really interesting to think about that, because you can see that on the individual level and on the collective level, where a lot of the times it's like, there are things that people are fighting about with politics, and I'm like, guys, we don't have to do this. We don't have to do this. We don't have to have this conversation. I don't have to know about your dating preferences. I don't have to know about what you think women should be wearing or whatever. I don't have to know your opinion on seed oils and whether you think people that eat seed oils are stupid. Like, there's just so many things that we don't have to have major heated debates on. You could just do it or don't do it, but like, this is the problem with social media, is that it shoves all these things in our face, and then we feel like we have to comment on everything. And then, of course, these things turn into a debate, and it's like a cultural debate, and it's so heated, and it's like, oh, these people want us all to be eating seed oils, and those people want to take our seed oils from us. And it's just like, we don't have to do this. We don't have to do this. Does this really matter? And so, honestly, one of the benefits of having death more present in your life, in your mind, is that it gives you clarity to be able to discern what really matters. Because so often it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There are so many things that I see online that I'm like, oh, I want to comment on that. Maybe I should write about this. Maybe I should do a video on this. Maybe I should do a live stream on this. And I'm like, will I care about this in 5 years? Is this something that I want to leave behind as my legacy? That will clarify shit for you like probably nothing else, because suddenly you get what is so hard for us to often get, which is you don't have as much time as you think. Your life is probably shorter than you think. And so the time that you spend creating some reaction video to some fool that you don't even like, who's not even actually honestly engaging with you in good faith, or something that you're going to that you're like, oh, I really don't even want to go to this thing, but I probably should go to it because I don't know, like, why not? Maybe it'll be beneficial in some way that I can't conceive of. Are you sure that's what you want to do? Because if you only had 1 week left on Earth, Is that what you would do? And it's not like right, the hard thing is, well, I can't live like I have 1 week left on earth, right? Because I would immediately quit doing all work and just like go spend my time with my family entirely. But right there, you have some clarity, which is, okay, I'm not going to quit my job and go spend every waking hour with my family crying and telling them I love them, but I am going to call them more. And maybe I will make some time to do something with them this week after all. And I swear that is one of the most powerful things about reflecting on death that I have found, which is just, there are so many times where I'm like, I think I need to call my parents. I think I need to make more time for my friends. And it gives me the urgency and the kick that I need to be able to make that choice when the other side of my brain, like that side of my brain that's like future, always planning for the next thing, always trying to achieve some goal that's in the distance, that side of my brain gets so like hooked into just going forward that I forget to consider that forward isn't guaranteed to me. And if I live in that way, then I need more balance. I need balance between how I'm spending my time now and whether it's actually fulfilling and I'm taking the time that I need to be with people I care about and the time I spend pursuing my future goals. So that kind of balance is a lot more available to you when you consider that your life is not guaranteed and you do not have potentially as much time as you think. Okay, so I think that this is one of the things that is a useful practice for adding death back into life, which is just doing straight up that. Just keep that in your back pocket, which is, would I be living the way that I'm living if I knew I had much less time than I thought? And it doesn't have to be as crazy as like, I've got 1 day left. What am I going to do? That's a little hard to act upon. But if you thought, I don't know, maybe in 3 years, someone I love will pass away or I will pass away, you might live a little more urgently and make a little more time for the people you care about and for the things that you truly care about than you probably are right now. And so that is one of those exercises that helps us bring death back into life in a way that's really clarifying and productive. Okay, so let's talk about some other elements here of death, which is the more cultural element. We talked about this a little bit in the beginning in terms of like the lack of presence that death has in our culture. And part of that is because we have many different cultures, right? American culture is largely a blend of many different cultures. And so my culture practices Dia de los Muertos, which is, I'm not Mexican, I'm Cuban, but my grandmother still practiced a version of that. And I also have like another side of my culture that doesn't really practice any kind of like death rituals and things like that. And so there's no guarantee that American culture is going to give you some kind of death rituals or ways to connect with death that will be meaningful for you, because you're free to create your own or to practice the ones that you have already had or whatever it is. And so for some people, they don't really have any. And so that leaves us increasingly, as I think more people don't have any, because more people kind of like assimilate and just let go of those things as we move to different places where we're in neighborhoods where it's like a bunch of different cultures. And so there's just not a tendency to keep up these like older practices. We may forget why we did them to begin with, why they were part of people's histories. And so one of the things that I think is so interesting about Dia de los Muertos is that it is like this holiday that really makes death very in your face, very central, where there's like this celebration of death. And in the way that my grandmother did it, I can't speak to how the Mexican celebration of that holiday is because I have not participated in that. I know that it's like way more of like a parade and whatever and all these things. But for my grandmother, how she would practice it was like, it was just taking time to think about the people that had died, right? Like that was it. It was taking time to put up an altar, a candle, to pray, to put up the picture of people that had passed away, and just take time to reflect on those people. Now, let me know in the chat, because I'm very curious about this. Do you have something like that in your life? Do you have a ritual where at least once a year you spend time thinking about, reflecting, honoring people that you know who have died? Because I don't really have that, because my family, my direct like parents don't actually practice Dia de los Muertos anymore. My grandmother did. So that's not even something that I'm like having some kind of regular practice of. That's a choice that I have to make of something that I want to upkeep if I want to upkeep it. No one's going to like invite me to do it or something. And so I have the feeling that there are quite a lot of us that don't actually have these mortality reflective holidays or rituals or practices that are baked into our lives. And so we just don't really do them. And that is such an interesting and insightful thing to think about, because for so much of human history and for so many different cultures and societies, there have been rituals and practices by which people spend time reflecting on the dead, honoring the dead. And that seems to be something, to me, from my perspective, that is waning in practice. That is just not as much of that being done. I don't think I know a lot of people that have something like that. The closest corollary I know is people that make time to go visit a cemetery. And that counts. But I don't know how many people even do that. Yeah, I don't know. My family didn't do that a lot before my grandmother died, and we still had family members that had passed away, like not many, but still, and we weren't big on visiting cemeteries. I think I went once to visit a cemetery. So, and it's not even like my parents weren't taking me with them a bunch. Like, I just don't think it was a thing that they largely did. And it's not to say that everybody has to do it just in that way. There are different ways to honor the dead. It's not only going to a cemetery, but you could think about how the lack of that practice might not be something that we're really craving, right? Because it's sad. It's sad to spend time thinking about people that have died. So it's very easy for us to just not do it. And that's that. But then you have this situation where death is just out of sight, out of mind. And that is exactly the concern that I have, is that because people increasingly in a lot of parts of the West don't have a lot of connection to death or rituals around thinking about death or grieving or making it just a part of life in some way, we're being robbed of the benefits of having death more top of mind, by which we think, wow, life is really short and I'm so grateful that I'm alive today and blah, blah, blah. All these things that we would do and think of if we spend a little more time remembering that people die. People die, and people that you know have died. And that's something that we have to keep top of mind. And I just think that we don't. So I'm curious. I'm going to look into some of the comments here and see if anybody else is having that similar experience of not having a lot of like death practices in your life. Because I really do think that that is something that gives us a less realistic view of the world in some ways, where we're just not as connected to the fact that we are mortal and very fragile. Okay, so moving on to some of the other things. One of the things that I thought was a really interesting practice to think about in terms of reflecting on death was Buddhist practices in Tibet. So this is a practice in which people, well, monks specifically, meditate on the idea of death, on the idea of your final breath. That's pretty hardcore, right? Just imagine like an hour or more, of course, because if these are monks, they're spending all their time doing this meditation, just hours and hours and hours, meditating on your last breath, on the impermanence of your life, on the fact that you will cease to exist. Imagine how that would change your perspective, your way of being in the world, if you spent more time, hours even, just thinking about the fact that you will die one day. Just imagining that moment by which you take your last breaths. And it's amazing to think about that because it's happened so many times. There have been so many last breaths taken in our world, and yet we don't think about ours. And even if you conceptualize it like that exactly, as thinking about the day and the moment you will take your last breath, have you even thought about that before? Because I think I may have thought about that once before in my life, and it was because I was thinking about someone else that had died. Not that it just came to mind. And so that kind of proves my point though, right? Like the more distanced you are from actual death, the easier and more likely it is that you won't think about your own mortality, and that then influences how you live, how you look at the world, how much time you feel like you have, and whether you sense the fragility of life. And so that Buddhist practice of just meditating on the idea of your final breath is such a great example of what we so often don't do, which is the opposite, right? We just ignore it, and we're so wrapped up in like what's happening today, what's on the news, who said what's going on, what am I going to do today, what am I going to do tomorrow, how am I going to get this thing, how am I going to change that thing? And we're so wrapped up in like what's happening out there, what's happening tomorrow, the future I want, even the past, right? That's another place that we spend time in that's not actually the present. It doesn't speak to how much time we have. And our mortality is just thinking about what has happened, how I wish that thing went, what I should have done instead. And of course, that's wasted time when you're thinking about the fact that you have very little time on Earth, because you realize, oh, who gives a fuck about what happened back last year or what I said at that party or whatever I did wrong? Like, I'm alive now and I can do things now. So that's what I'm going to focus on. But again, you have to have a little bit of that perspective that I think is so powerfully given to us by thinking about death, which is just that you're going to die. And so how are you going to spend your time? I have a comment here that I want to respond to. Excuse me. I'm always using these live streaming softwares is always so difficult for me. Bear with me. I have a comment that says, do you think Christianity has influenced the lack of urgency, romanticizing afterlife as more perfect and this life being temporary, not eternal life? Ooh, that's such a great question. I could see it both ways, right? I could see how one would say that actually Christianity allows us to think about death more because we're thinking about the fact that we absolutely are going to die, and after death, there's a life, right? So there's like this real willingness to grapple with death potentially because of the idea of the afterlife. Whereas you could argue that those that don't believe in an afterlife have more of an incentive to ignore death and to not think about the fact of their death because there's nothing after it. And so all you have is this life. And so you don't want to think about this life ending. So that could be one way you could argue it. But of course, you could also argue the other side of that, which is, as you've noted, that the fact of believing in an afterlife could actually make you less inclined to grapple with death as something that is finite, as something that is that speaks to the impermanence of your existence. And instead, death becomes this kind of like, oh, I'm just walking through the door to the next life. And so then you would lose the kind of benefits that I've been describing that meditating on death can provide you, which is this like deeper appreciation for life, this urgency to do and to commit to what matters most to you, this ability to prioritize more accurately based on what matters most and to use your time well. And so you could see both of these. My personal opinion, I don't want to offend the Christians, but I do think that there's a tendency to view the afterlife and to be more focused on the afterlife as opposed to that little part in the middle where you die, because that really is the unpleasant part, right? The afterlife sounds fucking awesome. I would like to join the afterlife as well. I simply just don't believe that the afterlife works out quite the way it's often described in Christianity or in many other religions, or in any of them, really. But I love the idea, guys, and I hope it's true. But I do see that tendency to focus on the afterlife to the expense of maybe meditating specifically on death and the finality of that. And I'm sure that there are Christians who are examples of not that, who actually do really spend time thinking about the finiteness of death. And of course, there are different sects of Christianity, right? And some are potentially much more focused on the part of death and like what that means in their religion and how that's an important part of the transition to the afterlife. So I could see it in all these ways. I was talking about reincarnation with my fiance Jake recently because he did a 10-day silent meditation retreat, which we spoke about in the past live stream. So if you're interested in hearing about a 10-day silent meditation retreat and what that might do to you, go check out that live stream. It's very interesting. And because of him doing that, which it's kind of like a Buddhist practice, it's a Vipassana meditation, he thought more about reincarnation because that's something some Buddhists believe in. And we've discussed it, and I'm just like, again, that sounds too good to be true. Like, you just get born again as another person, or like you were a cat or something. Like, obviously I don't want to be born as a bug, so that's no good. That's not fun. But the idea that you could continue to live after life just seems like something we would just love to believe as human beings. It would just be, I would love to believe that this is not my one life and that's it. And so you have these different religious beliefs around what that would look like. And reincarnation is just one of these that I'm like, would be nice, wouldn't it? But not quite sure. But the interesting thing about that is that I do think that there is something to the idea of, what is it exactly? It's that something of us persists after our physical death. And when I say that, I mean it in the absolutely most stretched out way possible, which is like, it's not your personality, it's not your identity, it is unrecognizable from you, but some kind of essence, some kind of energy, some kind of consciousness could persist after death, just in the sense of like, it goes back into the animating force of whatever it is that births consciousness, whether it's conscious birds or conscious horses or whatever, like all these manifestations of consciousness, wherever that comes from, this life force, in some ways you could see how we go back to that, and thus we exist beyond death, but just in an absolutely, completely unrecognizable form, totally divorced from our individual current form. And I just think there's something like very poetically true about the idea that like, oh yeah, you'll have an afterlife, but you won't be you. You won't have any of the things that you have grown attached to as an individual human being, like your identity, your way of experiencing things, your physical form. All of that's gone. You get to exist after life, but with none of the things that you have come to love about existing. You will just exist. And so like, it just feels like that's the kind of, in some way, cruel joke that existence would play on us. Like, oh yeah, there's an afterlife, but it looks nothing like what you're talking about. And so all of that to say that I do think that our conceptions of afterlife can be escapist, or they can be things that help us meditate on the finiteness of our current life and the need to use that well in order to be satisfied with your life or to potentially have like a good next life. So it really is one of these things, like the way you use that could be the determining factor in whether it's actually helpful or hurtful. Okay, so we've talked about the Buddhist approach to thinking about death. We've talked about Dia de los Muertos and like that kind of practice of death and keeping it in your life in some way. And we've talked about how death can allow you to be more grateful for the life that you have right now. And I just can't emphasize that part of it enough, by the way, because let's talk about near-death experiences also. That's one that I definitely, we cannot have a live stream about death without having some near-death experience discussions. So I haven't had a lot of these. Let's see. The one that I had, I think, that is most present in my mind was when I was in Morocco and there was an earthquake and I was on the second story of a building and it just started to shake. And I was like, ooh, this could be it. I wasn't super like, oh my God, I'm dying. But it was very much like I could die. And I was in that moment of panic and like where you realize my life is not guaranteed, truly. Like this could be the thing that it left me really impacted afterwards, where it really just gave me that sense again that my life is not guaranteed to me. I could have been one of these people that you hear about in the news all the time. American travelers caught in an earthquake while on vacation in Morocco. So sad. Oh my God, that's such bad luck. Oh. And then you go on with your day. Like, I could have been the headline that you read, that you scrolled past and didn't even have like a deep reaction to, because you're just like, oh, that happens. That's so terrible. And then you move on. I could have been that person. And so I just think of it from that perspective, where it's like, I so often am in that place where I'm looking at someone else's tragedy and being like, oh my God, that's terrible. I can't imagine. What if I was the person? What if I was the tragedy that someone else was looking at? And when you have that kind of like zoomed out look, it makes it so much more real that you are not so special, that you are not subject to the unpredictability of this world. And we are so fragile. We are such fragile organisms. Like, you can just fall down and die. It just drives me nuts. Like, I think about this all the time, because every now and then you'll hear about the story of like someone just slipped and they hit their head and they died. Like, that just really, that one really drives me home, because it's like, you could just fall and that's it. You're out. Game's over. That's crazy to me, because of course you are so certain that that is definitely not what's going to happen to you. You're definitely not going to die because you just fall one day and hit yourself in the wrong way and boom. No one thinks that they're going to die that way. And yet people do. And so this is the kind of thing that like a near-death experience really helps you to realize that and to get over that sense of like, I'm somehow in some way so special that I'm not subject to the unpredictability of the world and to the fragility of human life. It's so hard to get ourselves to accept that, because it's scary. It's so scary to operate from the idea that I could go at any time. It really is like it's a hard thing to think about. And this is why I wanted to do this live stream, where it's like, okay, are we thinking about this at all? How do we think about this? What does this factor into in our culture and like our daily life and all these things? Like, it just seems like nobody talks about this. And in some ways, shouldn't we all be talking about death? Shouldn't this be the thing that we talk about the most? Because it's the thing that it's going to happen to all of us. And it's the thing that can happen so indiscriminately that it really does matter to everyone. Doesn't matter how much money you make, you can fall down too. Obviously, oh, but you have better health care, blah, blah, blah. All of that is true. But nonetheless, you can fall down too. You can get caught in an earthquake too. You are subject to the unpredictability of this world that so often takes us out. And so the fact that this is not the thing we talk about very often, if at all, very often, is so eye-opening to how much we're scared of it, to how disturbing it is to grapple with the fact that you could go at any time. I see we have some comments here that I want to look at. Benjamin says, I went with my Japanese wife to visit her grandfather's grave in a Buddhist temple. It was really just an urn with some mementos stored in a cabinet. I realized that I hadn't visited my own grandfather's grave in 20 years, but I still remember him vividly. Oh, I love that. I love that. Such a great story. I think there's something about like a lot of Asian cultures that have a little bit more of a reverence for death. I've seen that in some of the religious belief and some of like the cultural practices. I'm not sure why. It's interesting because these are in some ways like also very old cultures, very old religions. Like Buddhism is one of the older modern religions. And so I wonder how much that factors in to the amount that they grapple with death and that they are willing to like keep death in life. And yeah, the visiting graves is such a difficult thing too, because it's just like, in some ways it's just for you, right? Because I mean, if you're of the belief that I am, which is like there's not ghosts or someone looking down from heaven being like, good job visiting my grave, like I don't believe in that kind of conception of any afterlife. So really visiting the graves is for you in many ways. And I think that's the interesting thing about these rituals and practices around death, is that they really are for us in some ways and for our culture, so that we keep death in mind, so that we are aware of how finite life is. Okay, someone else, leaving art school, says, yes, it's almost an escape from death, the blessed afterlife. I've had one due to heat stroke. Oh, heat stroke. That's crazy. That sounds really scary. Our pastor at the church we used to go to died that way. Heat stroke? Oh my God. That's intense. Where I kind of want to ask where you live that you are at risk of heat stroke to this level and that people are dying from heat stroke. That's really scary. I've never taken heat stroke seriously, as a person in the world. I'm just like, that's not a concern to me. So that's also kind of like the interesting thing about death, is that there are these unique ways to which death threatens us. Heat stroke is probably not going to be the way I go out unless I move to some desert place and start doing serious outdoor activities. But there are going to be definitely other things that I'm at risk of that are unique to me. And I think in some ways, like for cultures that have been around long enough with those things, those threats then get kind of incorporated into the general culture. Like you can think of what's coming to my mind is how much people used to fight, how much there used to be conflict and war and battle and all these things. And so you had so much cultural practice and just conceptualization, stories around people going to battle and like what happens if you die in battle, and the heroification of people that die in battle. And so like even the ways that people die in some cultures and some societies are part of the culture. Like it gets accounted for in what's honorable, what's like turned into stories and myths. And we don't really have that in a lot of modern Western society, where there's like this accounting of, oh, this is one of the common ways that people die. And so we have ideas around that, like myths and stories and like kind of conceptualizations around, oh, you know, people that died in such way, it means that they're going to have this thing in the afterlife, or it means that they're heroes, or whatever it is. Like, we don't have that. It's more something left to the individual culture. From falling. Pastor died from falling. Ooh, yeah. See, that's, people just fall. It really, there's something about the death by falling that just drives me nuts, because it's such a reminder of how random death can be, that you just fall and that's it. And it's like, that's it. There's something so random and like banal, you know, kind of mundane about death by falling, that I think it makes it an incredibly powerful reminder of how fragile we are. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Joseph Campbell and Jung's conceptions of death. So I love this quote that I found from Joseph Campbell. Participate joyfully in the sorrows of the world. The idea behind this was that acknowledging death and suffering helps you to live a more fulfilling life. And it just makes so much sense that rather than ignore or turn away from death and suffering as part of life, when you accept and embrace these things as part of life, you can actually be more grateful for life and thus have a more fulfilling life. And so I love that he articulated it in this way, because it's just, I should have made that the title of the live stream, like participate in the sorrows of life joyfully, because that's really what it comes down to. It's not that death is, oh, so wonderful and like, I just love it. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I'm going to be real honest with you. Like, I very much have to convince myself all the time that I am mortal, because it just seems so impossible to me that one day I will die. Even as I say it, I'm like, they're going to come up with something, you know, they're going to come up with something. And yeah, I might be really old, but die? No, they're going to come up with something. So I have to convince myself so hard that, yeah, I could die. And I think what actually does it more for me than like, oh, one day I'm just going to die of old age, because I'm like, I just swear they're going to come up with something, is that you can still die in a car accident. You can die in these many random normal ways that people die, and there is no longevity tincture or special process that can save you if you get real fucked up in a car accident or something of this sort. Then you're just going to die. And so those are the kind of things that it's like, you, one way or another, you are mortal, and there is a way to remind yourself that you are mortal. And so in keeping that present with you, in keeping that conception of like, whether I believe that I'll die of old age or not, or whatever it is, death and suffering are part of life. They're inevitable parts of life. You just have this greater appreciation for the mundane, right? Which is like, in some ways, I think very hard for us now in modern society, in these like tech-driven, abundant societies where it just feels like everybody's trying to climb the ladder and be super successful and like do all these different things, because like never before we can see the Joneses, and there's this desire to do the best, like be the best and participate in all the things, and there's FOMO more than ever before because you can see all the cool things that people are doing. And it's just like, in some ways, it's never been harder to be appreciative of the mundane, of just that moment where you wake up in bed and that's it. It's just your same bedroom, your same home, your same job is going to be done that day. Nothing really glamorous or special or exciting going on. Can you be grateful for that in the way that someone who woke up from a coma would be grateful if they could just be plopped back into their life before they had an accident that put them into a coma. Can you imagine connecting to that sense of gratitude and excitement for life of someone who almost didn't have the chance to ever experience those mundane moments again? That's the kind of meditation on death and the fragility of life that I find the most impactful, because those are actually the times that it's so hard for us to feel grateful. It's the mundane, it's the everyday, because we are built to strive for tomorrow. We are built to have long-term goals and think about what's next. I'm not satisfied with this. And I was just thinking about it like before we started the live stream, because every now and then I try to like trick my brain into thinking that I'm like a time traveler from the 1400s and that I've just been like plopped into this position in life where it's like, you have electricity, you have an AC, your fridge is stocked with the most delicious food ever, and food is actually very easy to procure. You don't grow it yourself anymore. You go to the store and it's everything in the world that you could imagine. You have running water, you have hot water, you have medicine, you have entertainment up to your ears that you will never be able to finish. You can get in a car or a plane and go see all these different parts in the world. If you really put yourself through that exercise of like time traveler from the 1400s or something, it's like you're dropped into Disneyland. It's just nuts to think about what it is like to live in our societies now. And yet, doesn't it kind of feel like most people think it's the opposite of Disneyland? It's just like, oh, this shit is going to hell. Everybody's crazy. Our culture is broken. Our government is broken. There's wars all over the world. There's poverty. There's this, that, and the other. People are so negative. And it's like, if you just think about what it used to be like for almost all of humanity, you are in Disneyland. Like, you are living in Disneyland every single moment. And yet, we struggle so much to feel that because of the hedonic treadmill, because of our human engineering to never be satisfied with what we have, to immediately grow accustomed to what is normal around us, and then to want the next thing. And so that natural process of never being satisfied often makes us blind to how things are actually quite good for us, and then we can't enjoy it as much. And the bigger danger is that we get so blind to the fact that there is a lot of good around us that we don't do the things necessary to maintain those things. And so I bring that up in the sense of like, it's a very similar practice to the gratitude practice in that way, which is the more that you recognize how your life is just not guaranteed to you, and how these mundane moments where you're just sitting on the couch or opening up your fridge to have some whatever healthy meal that you're trying to get yourself to eat so you can be healthy and you're not excited about it. All of these mundane moments are someone else's absolutely Disneyland fantasy, and you are there struggling to even be grateful for them. And so in that same vein, embracing death, embracing suffering as part of normal life, these are the things that help us to see more clearly and to have that kind of like deeper connection to reality, which is, the reality is, it's probably not as bad as you think it is. It's just so often the truth. And I'm speaking to myself truly. Like, I am not trying to tell you that some terrible thing you're going through is not that bad. But so often that is what I need to hear. So I put that out there for those who resonate with it. The other thing that the other thing that Joseph Campbell spoke about in terms of death was dying before you die. So this is the idea of letting go of ego and fear, which allows a person to live so fully and authentically, it is like they've had this new lease on life. And so again, we have this kind of phenomenon by which death becomes this symbol, this reminder of the preciousness of life and of what we're really seeking in life, which is growth and fulfillment. And so keeping death in mind, I think, gives us a little bit more of like a capacity to deal with loss and change. Because what is a better reminder of the inevitability of change than death? And this is the thing that I think we so often don't want to be reminded of, which is change is going to happen. This is another thing that I just struggle with so hard. I'm gonna be real with you guys. I'm gonna keep it super, super honest here. One of the reasons that I started doing a live stream was because I was like, one day I'm gonna be old. One day I'm gonna be old and wrinkled and gray hair, and I'm gonna look so different. And I'm gonna think, damn, if I still looked the way that I looked when I was 33, I would be taking a selfie every day. I'd be on camera every day, just preserving, just enjoying me at peak physical being. And so I was like, you know what? I should do more video things because I like doing video, and I'm not going to have this physical form forever. It's going to change. And that is a lot of like a more superficial version of being grateful for the moment and taking into account death. But in some ways, it's not, because I so often see this phenomenon by which people around my age go in the opposite direction, right? Which is like, no, they're not putting on makeup all the time or putting on the best clothes or being super obsessed with their looks, because in another way, that is also a problem with accepting mortality, right? So you get that other extreme where it's like you're so resistant to the idea of physical change and of aging that you're really desperately trying to keep things the same and like control your image. That goes too far to that other side then. But then there's this other element by which people are so resistant to change and mortality that it's just, I don't care. I'm not even thinking about it. I wear sweatpants every day, and I never do my hair. I don't care to dress up nice. I don't go to the gym, whatever. Just not connected whatsoever to my present physical form. Doesn't matter. And I don't think that that's very healthy either, because I think that in the same way that we want to be connected to the impermanence of life and the fact that like change is going to happen and you could die at any moment, and like this is the reality of our fragile mortal existence, would that not also then lead you to kind of appreciate having a physical body, like a physical form that functions? You know, if your body is healthy, like if you're still young and you have this like appearance that hasn't been changed by aging, would you not then appreciate that more if you're really tuned into the fact that you only have this for a little bit, a fraction of your life, which is even smaller than the fact that your life is a fraction of time itself. So you really have this time with your physical form in like peak youth for a very short amount of time. And so would you not then appreciate it and use it during that time? And so that's where I'm at on that. I think that in a way we can appreciate our youth in a more healthy form by thinking about the fact that it too is impermanent and also not guaranteed to us, because you'll be lucky to age, right? That's the better scenario, is that you get to 60, 70, 80. That's a good thing. And you can value that more if you also spent the time to value when you were 20, 30, 40, 50. A comment from Fountainhead Forum. I'm sad about Michelle Trachtenberg and Gene Hackman. Thank you for bringing this up, because I completely did not connect the fact that I chose to do this live stream on death in the aftermath of these two like really kind of jarring celebrity deaths. Michelle Trachtenberg was pronounced dead a few days ago. I don't know why. I think it was complications from a liver transplant, potentially. And that one just hit me really weird because I was like, she's been out of the spotlight for a while, I think, and was like one of these child stars that was in a lot of like the kid movies I watched, like the Disney type movies. And of course, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is super iconic. And then to hear that she died, it was just like, reminder, life is not guaranteed, just comes out of nowhere for anybody. Can be someone who is wealthy and you would think, oh my God, I'd love to have that dream life. She's had like such a great acting career and now she's just coasting. She's made her money. Boom, gone. Life is over. 39. I think she was 39, which is like, damn, you did not even make it to 40. That's crazy. I'm 33. So I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, 40, that's going to be weird. Like, oh, I'm going to be 40 and I don't know what I'm going to do with that. But like, okay, that's great. It's good. I want to age, but 40. And now it's like, wow, I would be grateful to get to 40 and to live past that because she did not. And that's a tragedy. That's such a sad thing when someone's life is cut short like that. But it's such a reminder that it just happens. It just happens. I'm sure she didn't expect it. And then it just happened. And that there's something so jarring about that. And then now we hear about Gene Hackman, which it's like, oh my God, this iconic actor that has been in so many great movies. And there's something very strange about when these kind of actors die, because it's just like, oh, that's right. They're mortal too. Even though they're immortalized in their characters on screen, they are mortal too. And there's almost something that feels slightly jarring when actors die, because it's like you're just so preserved in the films that you make. And it's such a reminder that time continues on despite time being frozen in that film and you being frozen in that film. And so these deaths that just happen, it's just like, wow, just comes out of nowhere. And again, this is the weird thing where I'm like, yes, I see it on social media. I see the commentary that it's like, oh, it's sad. So-and-so died, so-and-so died. And there's some elements of like remembering them, but then it's just like the news cycle continues on. And this is something that hits me so much. It's just like, you're going to die and the world is going to keep spinning like nothing happened. And that has to be one of the weirdest things to try to wrap your head around, which is you can be an amazing famous actor and in this news cycle, you're going to get one day, maybe 2 days max. If you are just an icon, you get 2 days of news and attention, and then it's on to the next thing. And you better hope that there's something that doesn't bump you out of the news cycle, because if not, you're definitely gone. Like, the news cycle moves so fast now that we don't even have time as a culture collectively to kind of grapple with these prominent public figure deaths. And again, this is one of the things that I think can impact us in a very strange way that disconnects us from the reality of our mortality. We don't even spend the time thinking about these great actors and public figures that have died for like more than a day or two. I remember when David Lynch died recently, and it was like, I saw so much of like an outpouring of people that were fans of his for a day. And then, you know, somewhat on the second day after. And then it was just like, world kept on spinning, news cycle kept on cycling. And there's something about that process that, yes, both robs us of the time to really grapple with mortality and the loss of that public figure, but really speaks in a kind of jarring way to how fast the world keeps moving and to how not special you are. Like, you can be David Lynch, okay? You can be some iconic actor and everybody else keeps going. And that's such a fascinating thing to meditate on, because it's like, I can have this incredible career. I can be this big celebrity that people recognize. I can get this outpouring of sympathy on the day of my death being announced, and yet people are going to keep on living, even if you are some like huge celebrity. And there's something about that that really just reminds you that do what you actually want to do. Don't do things that you think are going to immortalize you, or chasing status, or all these things, because you will be forgotten. You will be forgotten. And that is just crazy to me to think about. So yeah, so I appreciate you bringing up those people, because it's sad also, you know, just sad to lose these public figures that, at least for me, I have positive memories of the work that they've done. And it is kind of just this jarring thing to hear about deaths of people that you've seen in your life, like in the art that you consumed for years and years. Okay, let me move on to my next point here about Jung's look on death, which I thought was really interesting. So of course there's like a lot more to what I'm going to describe here. I'm giving you the digested version here. But Jung believed that death was a part of individuation. And individuation is essentially his term for, let's call it, personal development, growth. And so his idea was that confronting death is actually an integral part of your personal development. And so, of course, you have death at the end of your life, which is the more obvious confrontation with death. But you also have all the years leading up to that death. And so it's very easy for us now to ignore death up until it's really, really close. Like we are unable to do things, we are sick, we are in the hospital, these kind of instances where it's like, I'm obviously not well. But what about all the rest of the time where you're healthy, you're doing your thing, you're thinking about the future, you're making plans, you are not planning to die? How do you relate to death then? And how does that relation impact your personal growth? And so the idea that Jung sets forth is that essentially the way that you are relating to death is a part of your way of relating to life. And so you have this concept that Jung came up with, which is the shadow. And the shadow is essentially all the things about you that you do not recognize, that are essentially in your unconscious. You don't accept that these are personality traits that you have, or problems that you have, or desires that you have. They're out of sight, out of mind, but they are you. And oftentimes other people do see your shadow. They do see the fact that you're a control freak, even though you believe you're super laid back. So the control freak part of you would be in the shadow. And so death can be in your shadow. Your relationship to death, your beliefs on death can be part of the shadow, the things that you don't grapple with, but are nonetheless part of who you are, and thus influence you. And so this was one of the key parts of Jung's idea of the shadow, was that you're influenced by this nonetheless, whether you are thinking about it consciously or whether it is driving you unconsciously. So it's better for your personal development if you try to see what you are hiding in the shadow. So this is something that comes up against the ego. The ego wants you to remain the way you are. It has already this conception of who you are, and that does not include the shadow. And so you have this kind of like battle between who you think you are and who you really are. And part of who you really are is in the shadow. And so part of that process of growth of it as an individual, better understanding yourself, is figuring out what's in the shadow in relation to death. What have you placed out of mind that is related to mortality, to your views on death, your own death, the death of other people? Because this is another thing that I think is highly influential upon us, which is Are we thinking about the people in our lives who we love and their potential deaths? Do you want to do something with those people before their deaths? Are there things that you need to say to them before they die? Because this is the common experience, like the cliche of, I never got to say thank you, I never got to say goodbye, or all these things that we see depicted in art. The idea that someone had unfinished business and then the person will never be reached again because they died. And so part of this process of personal development really does actually require you to think about death, because those are strong beliefs. This is one of the most human, real things that all of us will go through, which is death, both our own and the death of people we care about, or even the death of people that we don't know. That can be also impactful, like we just described of the celebrity deaths. And so if we don't take the time to think about death, to think about the death of the people that we love, because that's real. That's just as real as our impending death, our potential accidental, unexpected death. If we don't take the time to take that reality seriously, we may be in a lot of trouble when that day comes and we have kept all the feelings that we have about what I need to say, what I wish I had done, pushed down into the shadow, pushed out of sight, out of mind, and now they have been forced into our consciousness, which can be a very painful, jarring, traumatic, destabilizing experience when things that you were trying to remain unconscious of are now forced into your face, and now you have to grapple with them. You have no choice. Much better to willingly move forward and try to figure out, what are the things that I am not accounting for in my life? What are the things that I'm ignoring? And death is almost certainly one of those things in some way or another, just because it's in every person's life and we all have feelings about it. That's it. Those are the key ingredients that means something about death is probably in your shadow. And so the beauty of this is that when you willingly bring things up into your shadow, you have a better chance to actually grow in a way that's less painful, and you get to grow ahead of schedule instead of being at the mercy of some external event that forces you to grow when you weren't ready at all. And so that process then of reflecting on death and what it means to you, what things might change in your life if there was a death, all these different things really can be an accelerator for your personal growth and for living a meaningful life. Because think about Jung's description of death as a crucial part of individuation. Of course, the common view on this is that, well, as you reach your later end years where you're not working anymore, you're starting to slow down, you're seeing your children grow up and have their own families, and you're facing these last years where you know people don't live much longer than what I've got left. That is the obvious time where you have to start thinking about, what does death mean for me? Have I done the things that I want to do? What am I going to do with these last years? What do I want to leave behind? But what if you did it ahead of schedule? How much earlier could you start that process? And what would the benefits be if you started that process a lot earlier than most people do? Because rather than wait until it is blatantly in your face that, yeah, death is around the corner for you, what if you did it way before that time? How would you be a different person? How would your life become more fulfilling? How would you be around the people that you engage with? How would you treat people differently? And so it's really a powerful thing to think about. And this is why I think it's so crazy that nobody talks about death. Like, we don't talk about it. I don't know. Am I wrong? I don't see anybody talking about it. So this is kind of why I decided to talk about it, because I was like, well, I could talk about all the things that are going on, but does anybody talk about death? Like, should we just talk about death? And that's what we're going to do here. That is what we're doing. So I think that's just, maybe if you take nothing else away from that, from this whole live stream, think about that. The way that meditating on your beliefs about death and the process of death getting in your life some way, whether it's your death or the death of people in your life, how that would change you, and whether you can take action sooner than later in facing death in that way. That is basically the live stream in a nutshell. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the ways that we can actually do this pragmatically, besides just that more generalized advice of like, think about it, think about death, right? Like, what do we actually do here? How do we actually do this? And I think that this is a really personal thing that you will have to decide. And there is no way that I can just be like, this is the thing to do, because it's going to be different for people that have their different beliefs, different relationships around death, different capacities for dealing with death, all of that. But there's these ideas that we can lean on or be inspired by in choosing how we bring more death into our life in a way that is healthy and constructive and gives us all the benefits that we've been talking about in terms of clarity on what matters to you, gratitude for the mundane, everyday experience of life, process of growth by not having these feelings or beliefs about death thrown in your face once it happens somehow and you're not prepared for it because you haven't faced it in any way. And so one of these things is the memento mori. So you've probably heard about this. It is just the idea of having a token that reminds you about the fragility of death. I think the history, it's like a Greek thing, like an ancient Greek thing. It was like, I believe it was a coin that people had that had like a skull printed on it or something like that. There's just so many different ways to do it now that I could be melding the ancient version with the modern versions of it. But essentially the concept is a reminder of death. That's essentially what memento mori means. And so the point is to have some kind of item, something that can trigger the frame of mind you're trying to embody in terms of keeping death top of mind, as opposed to just living like we're never going to die and leaving that totally out of mind, and thus not living a life that's actually realistic and in tune with our mortality and the unpredictability of life. So you want that memento mori because it allows you to wake up and to remember, oh, I'm living like I have forever, and that is not real. So I need to live real. I need to get real and actually grapple with the fact that my life is finite and fragile. And how would I live differently right now if I truly believe that? That's what the memento mori is for. And so you can make that with anything. People have like a coin for that, but you can just make your own, and that's what it's for. So the other way that one could do this, and I think this is like a very interesting suggestion, is just to talk about death, which is what I'm doing. So this is what I actually chose to do as my pragmatic approach to bringing more death into my life in a way that's constructive, which is, let's just talk about it, because nobody seems to talk about it that much. And I guess I have to be the one then. And so it's kind of a morbid topic, obviously, and I don't know how much this is gonna be popular with people, but it's really good for you if that's what you want, if you want to bring that awareness around death more into your life and think that through. Because it just comes down to that very simple truism, which is whatever you give your attention to is what grows. So a lot of us potentially are giving our attention to the daily news cycle and like, oh, we're watching our shows on TV and we're like thinking about all the things we want to achieve and what we should do and what we have to do. And yeah, okay, a lot of these things are necessary. But do we then intentionally carve out time for considering our mortality, for reconnecting with the fragility of life, with the fact that we could die, the people we know could die, and really spending that time feeling that fragility of life? Because like I said in the beginning, it's a feeling. I really want to impart that it's not an intellectual exercise. It starts as an intellectual exercise, but it ends as a feeling. And the feeling really should be like this intense, how can I describe it? I think the feeling you're trying to go for when you connect to this idea of like, life is fragile, I could die at any moment, the people I know could die at any moment, like life is unpredictable, I am mortal. That is supposed to get you towards this sense of urgency for living, clarity for what matters, openness to what is truly like reality, not a sense of, oh, this should be like this, oh, I don't like that this is like this, just a sense of I'm alive and this is what is, and I'm so happy to participate in what is. You know, not this kind of thing that we often do, which is, I wish this was like this, I don't want to do this. If you were dying and someone said, oh my God, we just cured your illness, that's it, you're good to go, you would be so grateful to do anything, any single thing. All the bullshit of waiting in a line at Starbucks or getting in traffic, all of it would seem beautiful and renewed, and you'd be full of gratitude for being able to participate in these boring, mundane human experiences. That is the feeling that we are going for when we meditate and reflect on our own mortality. You want to have this like little tiny death, like this feeling of like, oh my gosh, I'm actually alive. What if I wasn't alive? And I am. Oh, I'm so glad. That's the feeling we want. And so that is what this process should be. So that is what I impart to you. Try to go for that. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It really is trying to move yourself into this feeling. Okay. And so I think that, let's see, in my mind, like this is all a very black sheep thing, right? And so, oh, by the way, make sure that you're subscribed to the Black Sheep. Make sure that you are signed up so you don't miss the other live streams. Definitely check out some of the past ones, and let me know in the comments what you have thought about this live stream and how you're going to incorporate death more into your life, because I'd love to hear that. But I was thinking that there is something like really black sheep about the idea of incorporating death into life, actively seeking to engage with death, and doing this ahead of schedule, right? Not waiting till the end or waiting till it's too late. And what I mean by that being black sheep, is that it's like, it's what is not done, right? So when I came across this idea of the black sheep, the person who goes off on their own path away from the herd, who challenges the herd because they found this better way of doing something or seeing something, and thus that brings more benefits to the herd, because it's like, hey, look what I have found, look what I'm trying to show you. I'm going to actually go off in this other direction to show you that there's a better way to do this. That process is something that really creates a lot of like growth and inspiration and innovation. I mean, it's just like throughout history, you have these black sheep figures who don't match up with whatever the status quo is at the time. They get a lot of like pushback, ridicule, demonization. I mean, people have been killed, executed for being ahead of their time. I believe it's Giordano Bruno was this, I think it's called an astrologer, what he was, some kind of, old-timey scientist around the time of Galileo. Mans was burned at the stake for hypothesizing that there were other planets out there. That's real. And so when I talk about the black sheep, like that is the kind of that's the extreme, but this is the kind of pattern that I'm discussing, is people who are ahead of their culture, ahead of their time in a way that actually is so beneficial, but they have to be like a little weird to get there. They have to be a little out of step with the majority. And what we hope for is a culture that has the tolerance and the freedom for those people to go to that next place before the herd is ready to, because that is actually how the herd gets there faster, as opposed to demonizing people, burning them at the stake and suppressing them. And so then we are robbed of that understanding simply because we don't want that yet. We're uncomfortable with it. That's what we don't want. What we do want is a culture that says, okay, you can go do that. We're not into it. We don't want it, but you can go do it. Because then we can see, okay, that person's wrong. They tried to do some crazy experiment, blew up on their face. We don't want to do that. But sometimes that person is right. And when we're able to see them be right, let them make their arguments, let them do their experiment, then we can learn from that. And I think that death is one of these things that we can have a black sheep pattern around. Simply be the black sheep about death. Be a person who is willing to do the kind of uncomfortable thing of taking a little more time to think about death, to bring it into places where it's appropriate and even beneficial for people to think about it more, to take that time to really grapple with our mortality. And you know what? We have so many opportunities to do this, actually, because we hear terrible news of accidents where people die, or like we were just talking about these celebrity deaths, very often because we're connected to the world of news. And so instead of just passing over these things, these are opportunities to be black sheep and to actually spend the time meditating on death and to take it more seriously and to let it, and this is a beautiful thing, let the death of other people be an inspiration for you to return to the reality of your mortality, to reflect on the fragility of life. I think that's kind of the most beautiful thing that we could do to honor another person's death and life, is to think about our own death and feel gratitude for our own life. And yet that's not often what we do. And so you can be a black sheep in that way. You can push that forward. You can be the one that actually does that. And it's not that hard to do because the bar is really low, because we don't really deal with culture. I mean, we deal with death much in our culture. And I think it would help people a lot, because I see a lot of attachment to the news cycle and this kind of debates on like, oh, this cultural view or this preference or whatever, this opinion that I find offensive. And all of this is just like, is that really the priority for you? If you only had a month left on this earth, how much would you really care about this thing? And how would you treat it? How would you handle it? How would you treat the people around you? That kind of clarity is what we can bring to our society and to the people around us if we reflect on death ourselves. Because then we are in this place where we're the memento mori for other people, where we are not living in a way where it's like, I think I have all the time in the world. I'm not thinking about my fragility at all. I'm not thinking about the preciousness of life. And so when we're in that energy, then that's what we're spreading, right? Like that's kind of the the way that we're keeping things going and the example that we're setting. But if we're not doing that, if we're instead in this kind of like feeling of more gratitude for life, this sense of recognizing life's fragility, having our priorities set in order because we recognize our mortality, then that's the example we set. That's the tone we set. And I just think that is so powerful. It is really that way. Like I don't know how many times we have to hear, how many people have to say it throughout history. The change starts with you, all of the cliches, they're cliches for a reason. And here's the best part. It just makes your life better. So there you go. You don't have to do it to be a hero. You can just make your own life better. And the benefit is that other people will benefit from your life being better, from you living from this more connected, thoughtful place. And so I hope that that is inspiring you. I hope that this wasn't too depressing of a live stream. I actually didn't really find it depressing. I found it exactly as I thought I would find it, which is that reflecting on death and the impermanence of life really does give you a sense of renewed appreciation for your own life. And you know what I really find, which is important, it's just like, I'm so much more thoughtful about how I want to use my time in terms of like, am I going to be scrolling, or am I going to argue with this person, or am I going to pick a fight with my partner because of this, or am I going to call my parents today, or am I too busy? You know, all of these things that it's so easy to get sucked into when we're not really connected with how fragile life truly is. And that is just like, it's a weird thing, but like that's kind of why people say that death is the gift. Death is what gives life meaning. I know you've heard it. I know we've all heard it. And there's truth to it. So I leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed this live stream. Go forth and think about death a little more. I think it's good for us. Thank you for thinking about death with me. And please make sure that you're subscribed to the Black Sheep so you can stay up to date on our upcoming live streams, our new articles, all that good stuff. And if you liked this live stream, you will like some of the other ones for sure. I recommend you check out the ones that I've done on Joseph Campbell, and the more recent ones. Those are in a similar vein to this, and so you may enjoy that. Thank you for joining, and I leave you there. Have a good night.